The wind howled across the desolate Norwegian fjord like the cries of fallen warriors, cutting through Astrid's torn cloak as she stumbled through knee-deep snow, cast out by her own clan for refusing an arranged marriage to a brutal chieftain. The former Shieldmaiden faced certain death in the approaching blizzard. Her warrior training meant nothing against the merciless cold that was already claiming her fingers and toes. Then she saw it, a small hut, seemingly carved from ice itself, half buried in a drift that looked untouched for centuries. But Astrid was no ordinary Viking woman. Hidden beneath her exile was a secret. She was the last living descendant of the ancient Volva, the Norse sorceresses who once commanded the elements themselves. As her numb hands touched the frozen door, something extraordinary happened. The ice began to glow with an inner fire, responding to blood that carried magic older than the gods. What Astrid didn't know was that this hut held the key to powers that could either save her people from an coming invasion or destroy them all. But would mastering her heritage cost her everything she once believed about herself? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The warmth that emanated from the glowing door seeped through Astrid's frozen palms, sending jolts of sensation up her arms. She gasped, watching in wonder as intricate runes began to appear across the ice's surface, pulsing with an ethereal blue light that seemed to dance beneath the crystalline walls. Her grandmother's stories flooded back, whispered tales of the old magic, the kind that had been forbidden since the coming of the new gods. The door swung inward without resistance, revealing an interior that defied all logic. Where she expected cramped quarters filled with ice and decay, Astrid found a spacious room warmed by an invisible hearth. The walls, though still appearing to be carved from ice, radiated gentle heat. Shelves lined the far wall, filled with scrolls and artifacts that seemed untouched by time. In the center of the room stood a table made of what looked like compressed snow, yet solid as oak. Astrid stumbled inside, her legs finally giving way as the cold released its grip on her body. The door sealed itself behind her with a soft whisper, cutting off the howling wind. For the first time in 3 days, silence enveloped her, a silence so complete it felt sacred. As feeling returned to her extremities, she examined the space more carefully. The scrolls bore the same runic script she'd seen on the door, though these symbols seemed to shift and change when she wasn't looking directly at them. A small alcove held what appeared to be a mirror, but its surface showed not her reflection, but swirling mists that occasionally formed shapes, faces perhaps, or distant places. Her fingers traced along one of the scrolls, and suddenly the runes blazed to life. Words formed in her mind, not heard but understood, speaking of ancient pacts and elemental bonds. The Volva had not simply commanded magic, they had been vessels for it, conduits through which the very forces of nature could flow. A memory surfaced unbidden, her mother on her deathbed, pressing a small carved stone into Astrid's palm. "When the time comes," she had whispered, "remember that strength takes many forms. The old ways are not forgotten, only sleeping." Astrid reached for the stone now, still hanging from a leather cord around her neck, and gasped as it grew warm against her skin. The hut responded to the stone's awakening. Ice crystals on the walls began to dance and swirl, forming patterns that spoke of winter storms commanded rather than endured. The invisible fire grew stronger, and Astrid felt power coursing through her veins like liquid lightning. This was what she had always sensed lurking beneath the surface of her warrior's training, a deeper strength that her father had forbidden her to explore. Outside, the blizzard raged with increasing fury, but within the magical sanctuary, Astrid began to understand that her exile might not be the end of her story, but its true beginning. The scrolls spoke of great upheavals to come, of invasions from across the dark seas, and of the need for the old guardians to rise again. She spread her hands across the snow table, watching as images formed in its surface, longships on dark waters, bearing unfamiliar banners, warriors with strange armor and cruel weapons, heading for the very fjord that had cast her out. The vision showed her homeland burning, her people fleeing or falling beneath foreign blades. The irony was not lost on her. They had banished her for refusing to strengthen their clan through marriage, yet here she sat, awakening to powers that could protect them in ways no political alliance ever could. But would they accept her help when the time came, or would their fear of the old magic seal their doom? Astrid closed her eyes and felt the hut's ancient wisdom flowing into her consciousness. Whatever came next, she would be ready. The Shieldmaiden was gone, cast out into the snow. What emerged from this place would be something far more dangerous and far more necessary. The storm had passed by dawn, leaving behind a crystalline world that gleamed like polished steel under the pale sun. Astrid woke to silence so complete it felt like death itself had settled over the mountain. The fire had died to ash, yet the hut remained warm, impossibly warm, as if the very walls held heat within their bones. She sat up slowly, her breath visible in small puffs despite the warmth she felt. The wooden walls around her seemed different in the morning light. Where yesterday she had seen only crude timber blackened by age, now she noticed intricate carvings spiraling up toward the rafters. Runes, but not the familiar script her father had taught her. These symbols moved like living things when she wasn't looking directly at them, dancing at the edges of her vision. Her hand instinctively moved to her sword hilt, but she forced herself to stillness. Whatever dwelt in this place had shown her mercy through the night. The least she could do was not greet it with steel. The door opened with a whisper, and Astrid stepped outside into snow that reached her knees. The world had been transformed. What had been a barren mountainside now revealed itself as something far stranger. Ancient stone markers jutted from the white expanse like broken teeth, each one carved with the same flowing runes that adorned the hut's interior. A path wound between them, perfectly clear of snow despite the night storm. She followed it, her boots crunching through the crystalline surface. The path led down the mountain in gentle switchbacks, but it was what lay ahead that made her breath catch. The fjord spread below her like a map drawn by the gods themselves, and she could see everything, every village, every longhouse, every ship frozen in winter harbours. The sight should have been impossible from this height, yet each detail remained sharp as if viewed through the clearest ice. There, Bjornholm, where Jarl Magnus held court. The very sight of those familiar rooftops sent a familiar surge of rage through her chest. 6 months since her exile, 6 months since her shield sisters had turned their backs, while Magnus proclaimed her a coward before the assembled warriors. 6 months since Ragnar's death, in the failed raid she had planned. But now, staring down at the settlement that had cast her out, she felt something new stirring alongside the anger. The runes on the stones around her seemed to pulse with faint light, responding to her emotions like kindling to flame. A voice spoke behind her, ancient and amused. "Impressive, isn't it? The sight, I mean." Astrid spun, her sword clearing its sheath in one fluid motion. An old woman sat on a stone that had been empty moments before, her hair white as fresh snow and her eyes the deep blue of glacier ice. She wore robes that seemed cut from the winter sky itself, and when she smiled, Astrid saw too many teeth. "Peace, Shieldmaiden. If I meant you harm, you would never have found my hut." "Your hut?" Astrid kept her blade raised, though something about the woman's presence made her arms feel heavy as mountains. "Among other things, yes." The woman gestured toward the vista below. "Tell me, child, what do you see when you look upon your homeland?" "I see those who abandoned me, those who chose fear over loyalty." The woman tilted her head like a bird studying prey. "And what would you have them see when they look upon you?" The question hung in the air between them like a challenge. Astrid lowered her sword slowly, though she didn't sheath it. "I don't understand." "Don't you? You found your way to my threshold in the heart of a storm that should have killed you. You slept peacefully in a place where others would have fled screaming. The old blood runs strong in you, daughter of Thorvald, strong enough perhaps to reclaim what was stolen." "The old blood?" Astrid's voice came out as barely a whisper. Her grandmother had spoken of such things in hushed tones, tales of the first settlers who had made pacts with powers that dwelt in ice and stone. the magic your people have forgotten in their rush to embrace the white Christ. But the land remembers, even if its children do not. The woman stood, and though she appeared frail, Astrid felt power radiating from her like heat from a forge. The question is whether you have the courage to remember as well. The runes around them flared brighter, and Astrid felt something stirring deep in her bones, a recognition she couldn't name. Below in the fjord she could see smoke rising from Bjornholm's great hall where Magnus would be breaking his fast, secure in his power. "What are you offering?" Astrid asked. The woman's smile grew wider, showing those two sharp teeth. "Nothing you don't already possess, child. I offer only the chance to awaken what sleeps within you. The choice, as always, is yours." The wind picked up, swirling snow around them both, and in its whisper, Astrid heard the echo of her own name. The runes pulsed beneath Astrid's fingertips like a living heartbeat, their blue radiance casting dancing shadows across the ancient walls. She jerked her hand back, but the symbols continued to glow, spreading outward from where she had touched them in rippling waves of light. The temperature in the hut shifted dramatically. What had been bitter cold moments before now felt merely cool, as if invisible flames warmed the air itself. Astrid's breath no longer formed clouds, and she could feel sensation returning to her numbed fingers and toes. "What sorcery is this?" she whispered, backing toward the doorway. But as she moved, the light followed her retreat, illuminating more of the hut's interior. What she had taken for simple ice-covered furniture revealed itself to be something far more extraordinary. A wooden table stood in the center of the room, its surface carved with intricate patterns that seemed to shift in the blue light. Shelves lined the walls, holding vessels and tools that gleamed with the same ethereal luminescence as the runes. Against the far wall sat a loom, its frame draped with what appeared to be a half-finished tapestry. But this was no ordinary weaving. Threads of silver and gold were woven together with strands that seemed to capture starlight itself, creating patterns that moved and flowed like living water. Astrid's warrior instincts warred with her curiosity. Every fiber of her being screamed that she should flee this place of obvious magic, yet something deeper held her rooted in place. Perhaps it was desperation, or perhaps the strange sense of belonging that had drawn her here in the first place. A sound from outside made her freeze, the distant howl of wolves carried on the wind. The pack that had been tracking her for days had found her trail again. In her weakened state, she would not survive another encounter with them in the open wilderness. The decision was made for her. Astrid stepped fully into the hut and closed the door behind her. The moment the door sealed shut, the transformation accelerated. Ice melted from the walls in rivulets that somehow never reached the floor. The wooden surfaces beneath revealed intricate carvings that told stories she did not recognize, scenes of women wielding not weapons but forces of nature itself. Lightning danced from outstretched fingers, storms gathered at spoken words, and the very earth bent to feminine will. Astrid approached the loom, drawn by the hypnotic movement of its supernatural tapestry. As she drew closer, she could make out the images woven into the fabric. It depicted a great fjord, her fjord, but not as she knew it. In this vision, the waters ran crystal clear instead of the muddy brown she remembered. Green forests covered hillsides that in reality were barren rock. And scattered throughout the landscape were structures like this very hut, each glowing with the same blue radiance. "The old ways," she breathed, remembering fragments of stories her grandmother had told her in whispered voices when she was small. Tales of a time before the gods of war held dominion, when women who commanded the forces of life and growth were revered rather than scorned. Her fingers moved without conscious thought to touch one of the silver threads. The moment her skin made contact, images flooded her mind, visions that were both memory and prophecy. She saw herself as she had been, proud, strong, standing shield to shield with her sisters in the great hall of Jarl Magnus. Then came the shame, the accusations of cowardice, the exile that had stripped her of name and honor. But the vision did not end there. She saw herself as she could become, standing once again in that same hall, but this time the power she wielded was not granted by any Jarl's favor. Light emanated from her hands as it did from the runes on these walls. The very air bent to her will, and those who had cast her out now knelt before forces they could not comprehend. The images faded, leaving Astrid gasping. Her heart pounded with a mixture of terror and exhilaration. Whatever this place was, whoever had built it, they had left behind more than just shelter. They had left behind power. Outside, the wolf howls grew closer, but Astrid no longer felt the chill of fear. Something had awakened within her, something that had perhaps been sleeping her entire life. She moved to one of the carved shelves and lifted a crystal vial filled with luminescent liquid. The moment her fingers closed around it, knowledge flooded her mind, not just what it was, but how to use it. The wolves could come. Let them. When they arrived, they would not find the broken, exiled Shieldmaiden who had stumbled into this place. They would find something altogether different, something the Fjord had not seen for generations. Astrid smiled, and for the first time in months it was not bitter. The blue light of the runes reflected in her eyes as she began to plan not just her survival, but her return. The warmth that had enveloped Astrid through the night fled the moment she stepped outside. Dawn painted the snow-covered landscape in shades of rose and gold, but the beauty felt hollow against the weight pressing down on her chest. The hut behind her hummed with an energy that made her skin crawl, yet she found herself reluctant to venture too far from its walls. She had slept fitfully, haunted by dreams of fire and ice, of voices speaking in tongues she didn't recognize but somehow understood. The runic symbols had glowed brighter as darkness fell, casting dancing shadows that seemed to move independently of their light source. More than once she had awakened to find frost patterns on the windows that looked disturbingly like faces. Astrid gathered snow in her leather pouch, melting it over the still-burning fire that somehow never consumed the mystical wood. The water tasted clean, almost sweet, but it carried an undertone that reminded her of copper pennies. As she sipped, she noticed her reflection in the water's surface seemed to shimmer with the same ethereal quality as the hut's walls. The sound of approaching hoofbeats shattered the morning silence. Astrid's hand flew to her axe as 3 riders emerged from the tree line, their mounts snorting clouds of vapor in the frigid air. She recognized the lead rider immediately, Bjorn Ironwill, her former shield brother, his red beard braided with silver rings that marked his victories in battle. "Astrid Ravenclaw," he called out, his voice carrying across the clearing with the authority of one who now served Jarl Magnus directly. "You are summoned to appear before the Jarl." She stepped forward, deliberately positioning herself between the riders and the hut. On what grounds? Bjorn's eyes narrowed as they swept over her appearance. She wondered what he saw. Did the magic that suffused this place cling to her visibly? His horse shifted nervously, ears flattened against its skull as it regarded the ancient structure behind her. "Strange reports have reached the Jarl's ears," Bjorn replied carefully. "Farmers speak of lights in the northern woods, of sounds that carry on windless nights. And you, exile that you are, found here at the center of it all." He paused, studying her face. "What is this place, Astrid?" "Shelter," she replied simply, though her grip tightened on her weapon's handle. Nothing more. The rider to Bjorn's left, a younger man she didn't recognize, leaned forward in his saddle. "The very air feels wrong here. Look how the horses react." Indeed, all 3 mounts were displaying signs of distress, rolling their eyes and stepping sideways, despite their riders' attempts to control them. Astrid felt something shift in the air behind her, a subtle change in the hut's emanations that made her teeth ache. The runic symbols, invisible in daylight to untrained eyes, seemed to pulse with renewed vigor. She could sense their power like a warm current running beneath her skin. "Tell your Jarl that I have broken no laws," she said, taking another step forward. "My exile grants me the right to seek shelter where I find it, on lands that belong to no clan." Bjorn's expression grew troubled. "These are not ordinary lands, and we both know it. Our grandfathers told stories of this place, warned us to avoid it. Yet here you stand, unmarked by whatever dwells here." His hand moved to rest on his sword hilt. Some might call that witchcraft. The accusation hung in the air like a blade waiting to fall. Astrid felt the magic stirring more strongly now, responding to the threat. Frost began to form at her feet, spreading outward in patterns that matched the symbols carved into the hut's doorframe. The riders' horses whinnied in alarm, backing away despite their master's commands. "I am no witch," Astrid declared, though she wasn't entirely certain that was still true. "I'm a warrior who has found refuge in a harsh winter. Nothing more, nothing less." The youngest rider's horse reared suddenly, nearly unseating him. As he fought to regain control, his eyes fixed on something behind Astrid. She didn't need to turn to know that the hut had begun to glow faintly, its ancient magic responding to her emotional state. Bjorn raised his hand, signaling his companions to retreat. 3 days, Astrid. The Jarl grants you 3 days to present yourself at the hall, or he will send a larger party to collect you." His eyes met hers, with something that might have been regret. "For old friendship's sake, don't make us hunt you." They wheeled their mounts around and departed, but not before Bjorn cast one last look over his shoulder. Astrid remained motionless until the sound of hoofbeats faded completely, then slowly turned to face the hut. The glow was intensifying, and she could feel its power calling to her like a siren's song. 3 days. Time enough to uncover more of this place's secrets, or to flee deeper into the wilderness. As she approached the glowing doorway, Astrid realized that running was no longer an option. The storm raged for 3 days, but within the hut's walls, Astrid felt strangely at peace. The ancient structure held firm against winds that would have toppled lesser shelters, its ice-blue walls humming with an energy that seemed to pulse in rhythm with her heartbeat. She had discovered that touching certain symbols carved into the interior made them glow brighter, filling the space with warmth that penetrated deeper than any fire ever could. On the morning of the 4th day, silence finally settled over the mountains. Astrid emerged to find the landscape transformed. Snow had buried familiar landmarks, creating an alien world of pristine white dunes and crystalline formations. But something else had changed. The very air felt different, charged with possibility, and when she breathed, tiny motes of light danced from her lips like frost given life. She was examining these strange luminous particles when she heard the distant sound of voices carried on the wind. Her hand instinctively went to her axe as she spotted movement far below, a line of figures making their way up the mountain path. Even at this distance, she recognized the purposeful gait of warriors and the gleam of mail beneath winter cloaks. Astrid retreated into the hut, her mind racing. How had they found her so quickly? The storm should have covered her tracks completely, unless... Her gaze fell on the softly glowing walls around her. Perhaps this ancient magic was not as hidden as she had hoped. The symbols seemed to pulse more urgently now, as if responding to her anxiety. One in particular, a spiral surrounded by what looked like falling snow, grew so bright it cast dancing shadows across the room. When she pressed her palm against it, images flooded her mind. Warriors in the valley below, their leader a tall woman with intricate braids and a wolf-pelt cloak. Katja Ironwill, her former shield sister and now captain of Jarl Magnus's personal guard. The vision shifted, showing her their purpose. They had not come to drag her back in chains, but to seek her out. Word had spread of strange lights seen dancing above the mountain during the storm, and Magnus, ever hungry for power, wanted to know their source. Katja had volunteered to lead the expedition, though Astrid could see in the vision that her old friend's motives were far from simple loyalty to their Jarl. Astrid pulled her hand away, the images fading as the symbol dimmed. The magic was showing her truth, but it came with a price. She could feel something within her changing with each use, as if the ancient power was slowly rewriting the very essence of who she was. She moved to prepare for their arrival, gathering her meager possessions and considering her options. Running was still possible. She knew mountain paths that would take her beyond their reach. But as she reached for her pack, another symbol caught her eye, this one depicting two figures standing together against what appeared to be a great darkness. When their eyes met across the carved ice, both figures began to glow. The sound of boots crunching through snow grew louder. Astrid made her choice. She stepped outside, just as Katja crested the final ridge, her breath forming clouds in the bitter air. Behind her came 6 warriors, all faces Astrid recognized from the Jarl's hall. They stopped when they saw her, hands moving to weapons with practiced ease. "Astrid Ravenshield," Katja called out, her voice carrying both authority and something else. Relief, perhaps. "You're a difficult woman to find." "I didn't realize I was being sought," Astrid replied, though she kept her own hand near her axe. The mountains seemed a fitting place for the disgraced. Katja stepped closer, and Astrid could see the weight of command had changed her former shield sister. New scars marked her face, and her eyes held a hardness that hadn't been there before. "Disgrace is a luxury we can no longer afford. Something is stirring in the eastern settlements, raids unlike anything we've seen. The attackers move like shadows and strike with weapons that burn cold as winter itself. What does this have to do with me?" "The survivors speak of ancient magic turned to dark purpose," Katja continued. "Jarl Magnus remembers your grandmother's tales of the old ways. He believes you might have insights others lack." Astrid felt the hut's presence behind her like a warm hand on her shoulder. The magic within whispered of connections she was only beginning to understand, threads of power that stretched across the fjord like an invisible web. If someone was indeed wielding forgotten arts for destruction, then perhaps her discovery was not mere chance. "And if I refuse?" Katja's expression softened slightly. "Then I'll tell him you were never found. But Astrid, if these attacks continue, they'll reach our own settlements soon enough. Whatever drove you to these peaks, I don't think you'd stand by and watch innocents suffer." The wind picked up, swirling snow around them in patterns that seemed almost deliberate. Astrid glanced back at the ancient hut, knowing that leaving now meant abandoning the very source of her newfound power. Yet the magic pulsed with what felt like approval, as if it too understood that some purposes were worth the sacrifice. The morning brought no relief from the storm's fury. Snow continued to fall in thick curtains outside the hut's crystalline windows, and the wind howled like a pack of hungry wolves. Astrid pressed her palm against the glowing wall, feeling the steady pulse of magic beneath her fingers. The warmth had kept her alive through the night, but questions gnawed at her more fiercely than hunger. She traced the intricate patterns carved into the walls, following spirals and runes that seemed to shift when she wasn't looking directly at them. Some symbols she recognized from her grandmother's teachings, ancient Norse markings for protection, strength, and winter's embrace. Others were completely foreign, angular scripts that hurt her eyes to study for too long. "What were you hiding up here?" she whispered to the empty hut. As if responding to her voice, a section of the wall near the back corner began to emit a softer, bluer light. Astrid approached cautiously, her hand instinctively moving to her axe. The blue glow intensified, and she noticed a section of runes that formed a perfect circle. Without fully understanding why, she placed her palm in the center. The wall dissolved like morning mist. Behind it lay a small chamber she hadn't noticed before, though she could have sworn she'd examined every inch of the hut. Shelves lined the walls, filled with objects that made her breath catch in her throat. Scrolls bound with silver wire, bottles containing swirling, luminescent liquids, a staff carved from what looked like petrified lightning, and in the center of it all, a mirror that reflected not her own face, but swirling images of places she'd never seen. Astrid stepped into the hidden chamber, and immediately the temperature dropped. Her breath came in visible puffs, and frost began forming on her eyebrows. Whatever magic warmed the main hut didn't extend here. This was a place meant to preserve, to keep things frozen in time. She approached the nearest shelf and picked up one of the scrolls. The silver wire felt ice-cold against her fingers, but it unwound easily. The parchment within was covered in the same shifting runes, but as she stared at them, meanings began to form in her mind like words appearing in melting frost. The compact of the endless winter, she read, though she had no memory of learning such script. Binding the powers of ice and storm to the bloodline of Eriksdotter, that the northern passes might never be breached by southern armies. Her own family name leaped from the parchment like a physical blow. Eriksdotter. Her father had been Eric the Red-Handed, and his father before him Eric the Mountain Walker. The bloodline stretched back generations, but she'd never heard tales of magic or compacts with winter itself. She set the scroll aside with trembling hands and picked up another. This one spoke of rituals performed during the darkest nights of winter, of drawing power from the aurora itself, of warriors who could call blizzards to their aid and walk through snowstorms as easily as summer meadows. The text described abilities that sounded like myths, like the fantasies warriors told around fires to impress young shield-bearers. But the hut around her pulsed with very real magic, and the warmth that had saved her life was no fantasy. A third scroll made her sink to her knees on the frozen chamber floor. It contained detailed drawings of women who looked startlingly like her own reflection. The same strong jaw, the same pale eyes, the same wild hair that refused to be tamed. Below each drawing were names and dates stretching back 3 centuries. The last entry showed a woman labeled Thyra Eriksdotter, called Frostborn, with a date that placed her death nearly 200 years ago. Below Thyra's entry, someone had written in fresher ink, "The line sleeps until the fjord has need." Astrid's vision blurred as the implications crashed over her like an avalanche. Her family's disgrace, her exile, her desperate flight into the mountains, had it all been leading to this moment? Had she stumbled onto this hut by chance, or had something deeper guided her steps? She stood slowly and approached the mirror. Instead of her own reflection, it showed her images that made her heart race. Viking longships with sails that glowed with runic power, cutting through storms that would sink ordinary vessels. Warriors standing atop mountain peaks, calling down lightning from clear skies. And most disturbing of all, armies marching north through the passes. Southern armies with unfamiliar banners heading toward her people's lands. The final image that appeared in the mirror was of herself, but transformed. Ice crystals crowned her hair like a queen's circlet, and her eyes blazed with the same blue light that filled the hut. She held a spear that seemed to be carved from a single enormous icicle, and around her swirled a blizzard that moved at her command. The mirror went dark, reflecting only her current self, disgraced, exiled, alone, but not powerless. Not anymore. She gathered the scrolls carefully, wrapping them in her cloak. Whatever her ancestors had been, whatever compact they'd made with winter itself, that legacy now fell to her. The runes carved themselves deeper into the ice walls as Astrid's blood continued to seep into the ancient grooves. Each symbol pulsed with an ethereal blue light that seemed to breathe with her heartbeat, casting dancing shadows across the transformed interior of the hut. What had once been a simple shelter now resembled the hall of some forgotten god, its ceiling stretching impossibly high into darkness that her eyes could not penetrate. The voice that had spoken her name still echoed in her mind, though the air around her had fallen silent. She pressed her bleeding palm against her chest, feeling the warmth of her own life force, even as the magical cold seemed to seep into her bones. The transformation was not merely of the hut. She could sense something fundamental changing within herself, as if the ancient magic was rewriting the very essence of who she was. A soft chiming sound drew her attention to the far wall, where new runes were materializing in spiraling patterns. These glyphs were different from the others, more intricate and somehow alive with purpose. As she approached them, images began to flicker in the ice like reflections in still water. She saw herself, but not as she was now. This version of Astrid wore armor that gleamed with the same ethereal light as the runes, and her eyes held power that could command the very elements. Behind this vision Astrid stood an army unlike any she had ever seen. Warriors whose weapons crackled with lightning, whose shields bore the marks of ancient protection spells, whose very presence seemed to bend the natural world to their will. They stood not on familiar ground, but upon a crystalline plain that stretched to horizons, filled with floating islands and impossible architecture. The vision shifted, and she saw the fjord she knew transformed. The scattered villages had become gleaming cities connected by bridges of solid light. Ships sailed not just upon the water but through the air itself, their sails catching winds that bore the scent of magic. At the center of it all stood a massive structure that seemed to be carved from a single mountain-sized crystal, its faceted surface reflecting not the current world but the potential of what could be. But then the images darkened. She saw other armies massing, traditional Viking forces led by jarls, whose faces were twisted with rage and fear. They bore banners she recognized from the great houses, the very same leaders who had cast her out in disgrace. Their forces surrounded the magical realm, siege engines pointed at the crystal cities, their war cries echoing across dimensions. The vision Astrid raised a staff that blazed with the power of winter itself, and the scene exploded into chaos. Ice and fire clashed across the transformed landscape, while the very fabric of reality seemed to tear at the seams. She watched her other self-command forces that reshaped the battlefield with each gesture, but the cost was written in the devastation that spread outward like ripples from a stone cast into still water. The images faded, leaving Astrid alone with their implications. The magic she had awakened was not merely a tool for personal redemption, it was a force that could reshape the entire known world. The question that burned in her mind was whether such transformation would bring salvation or destruction to the people of the fjords. She turned away from the wall, only to find that the hut had changed again while she was transfixed by the visions. The simple wooden furniture had been replaced by furnishings that seemed grown rather than built, their surfaces bearing the same runic patterns that now covered every inch of the walls. A table of what appeared to be crystallized wood held objects that definitely had not been there before. A circlet of silver and ice, a staff topped with a crystal that contained what looked like captured starlight, and a book whose pages seemed to be made of compressed snow yet bore writing that shifted and changed as she watched. The air itself felt different now, charged with potential that made her skin tingle and her hair stand on end. She could sense the boundaries of the hut extending far beyond what her eyes could perceive, as if the small structure had become a gateway to something vast and unknowable. The very space seemed to exist partially outside the normal flow of time. She had no sense of whether moments or hours had passed since the transformation began. As she reached toward the circlet with trembling fingers, a new sound reached her ears from outside the hut. Voices carried on the wind, rough and familiar. The search party from Bjorn's settlement had finally tracked her to this remote location. Through the ice walls, she could see the wavering shapes of torches moving through the trees, growing steadily closer. The moment of choice had arrived sooner than she had expected. She could hear Bjorn's voice among the others, calling her name not with the warmth of their former friendship, but with the authority of a jarl commanding a disgraced exile to submit to judgment. They had come not to rescue her, but to ensure she posed no further threat to their ordered world. The blizzard struck without warning, howling down from the mountain peaks like the breath of angry gods. Astrid pressed herself against the ancient doorframe, watching as the world beyond disappeared into a wall of white fury. The wind screamed threats in a language older than the runes carved into her shelter's walls. Inside, the hut pulsed with warmth that defied nature. The walls hummed with power she was only beginning to understand, their ice-blue glow casting dancing shadows across her weathered hands. 3 days had passed since she'd first spoken to the magic dwelling within these walls, and each day brought new revelations that both thrilled and terrified her. She placed her palm against the nearest wall, feeling the ancient energy respond to her touch like a loyal hound recognizing its master. Images flooded her mind, memories not her own but those of the hut's previous inhabitant, A woman not unlike herself, scarred by battle and betrayal, who had discovered this place when the world above grew too cruel to bear. "Show me more," Astrid whispered, and the walls obliged. The visions came in fragments. The woman, Valdis, her name echoed in Astrid's thoughts, had been a Volva, a seer witch whose prophecies had earned her both reverence and fear. When the Jarls began to doubt her warnings about a coming darkness, when they cast her out as they had cast out Astrid, she had sought refuge in the forgotten places of the world. But Valdis had not merely hidden. She had learned to bind the ancient magic of the ice and stone, weaving protection spells into the very foundation of her sanctuary. The hut was not just shelter, it was a fortress, a repository of power, and a weapon waiting for the right hand to wield it. Thunder crashed overhead, though no storm should carry such force in winter. Astrid's blood chilled as she recognized the sound, war drums echoing off the mountain walls. Harold's search parties had found her general location, though the blizzard still concealed her exact refuge. Through the swirling snow, torchlight flickered like malevolent stars. Voices carried on the wind, harsh commands in her native tongue. They were close now, perhaps a stone's throw from her hidden doorway, but the magic that surrounded the hut bent their perception away from its entrance. They would see only unmarked snow and wind-carved ice. "Spread out!" Harold's voice cut through the storm like a blade. "The witch cannot have vanished completely. Search every crevice, every shadow." Astrid's fingers tightened around her axe handle. Through the visions, Valdis had shown her some of the hut's capabilities, but she was far from mastering them. If Harold's men discovered the entrance through sheer persistence, she would have to rely on steel rather than sorcery. A younger voice piped up, trembling with cold and fear. "Jarl Harold, perhaps we should return to the ships. This storm—" "The storm is nothing compared to what that woman will bring down upon us if we let her live." Harold's boots crunched closer, and Astrid could almost feel his presence like a weight upon her shoulders. "She has something that belongs to the old ways, something that could rally our enemies. We end this here." The irony was not lost on her. Harold feared what she might become, not knowing that his very pursuit was forcing her transformation. Each moment spent learning the hut's secrets made her stronger, more dangerous. His nightmares were becoming reality through his own actions. A new tremor ran through the walls, different from the magic's usual pulse. The power was responding to her emotional state, feeding on her anger and determination. Valdis had warned of this in her fragmented memories. The magic demanded balance, requiring wisdom to match its strength. Too much emotion, too little control, and it would consume her as surely as Harold's blade. Astrid forced herself to breathe slowly, feeling the wild energy settle back into its patient rhythm. Outside, the searchers continued their futile hunt, unaware they stood mere paces from their quarry. She could wait. The storm would not last forever, but neither would Harold's patience. Eventually, his men would convince him to retreat, and she would have more time to learn. But as she watched their torches weave through the blizzard, a different thought began to form. Why hide when she could strike? The magic thrumming through the walls offered possibilities beyond mere concealment. Valdis had been content to remain hidden, but Astrid was a warrior born. Perhaps it was time to remind Harold why the clan had once feared her name. She pressed both palms against the wall, feeling the ancient power surge toward her touch. The hut had been a sanctuary long enough. Tonight, it would become something far more dangerous. The wind outside began to change direction, no longer random but purposeful, carrying with it the promise of consequences Harold had never imagined possible. The first snowfall of winter arrived 3 days later, blanketing the fjord in pristine white that sparkled like crushed diamonds under the pale sun. Astrid stood at the threshold of her transformed dwelling, watching the flakes dance on currents of warm air that seemed to emanate from the very walls around her. The ancient magic had continued its work, weaving itself deeper into the structure with each passing hour. Where once crude timber had formed basic shelter, now intricate carvings spiraled up posts that gleamed with an inner light. The walls themselves had grown taller, broader, as if the magic fed on the surrounding forest and stone. Most remarkable of all were the new chambers that had appeared overnight, rooms she had never built, furnished with objects she could not name but somehow understood. In the largest of these new spaces, a pool of dark water reflected not the ceiling above, but distant places across the fjord. Astrid had discovered she could direct its visions with focused thought, watching the movements of jarls and their warriors, traders navigating the ice-locked waterways, and something else that made her blood run cold. Ships, warships, at least 30 of them, their dragon-head prows cutting through the choppy waters beyond the fjord's mouth. The insignia painted on their shields belonged to Jarl Grimwald the Black, whose appetite for conquest had already consumed 3 neighboring territories. His fleet moved with purpose, and Astrid needed no prophet to divine their destination. The pool's surface rippled, and the vision shifted to show Jarl Eric's hall. The old warrior sat hunched over his planning table, his remaining advisors clustered around maps that showed defensive positions along the fjord's narrowest points. But Astrid could see what Eric could not: the magical currents that flowed like invisible rivers through the landscape, currents that Grimwald's Volva had learned to read. The attack would not come from the expected direction. "They will strike at dawn, 2 days hence," Astrid murmured to the empty chamber. "From the eastern bay, where the currents run strongest." The knowledge sat heavy in her chest. Eric had banished her, stripped her of name and honor, cast her out to die in the wilderness. By every law of justice and pride she owed him nothing. Yet the thought of the fjord under Grimwald's rule, of the farms burned, the thralls taken, the careful balance of power shattered, stirred something deeper than personal grievance. A soft chime drew her attention to another of the magical chambers, this one filled with weapons that hummed with their own inner power. Spears that never missed their mark, arrows that could pierce any armor, swords that sang with the voices of ancient heroes. The magic offered her the means to tip any battle in her favor, to carve out her own domain through conquest rather than exile. But as her fingers traced the hilt of a blade that seemed forged from starlight itself, memories of her father's teachings surfaced unbidden. "Strength without purpose is mere destruction, daughter. A warrior's true test is not in how fiercely she can fight, but in choosing when to draw her sword." The pool's water began to glow, and when Astrid returned to its edge, she gasped at what she saw. The magic was not contained to her dwelling alone. Thin streams of luminous energy stretched out from the hut like a vast web, connecting to every standing stone, every ancient grove, every place where the old powers still lingered. The entire fjord was linked, waiting, as if the land itself anticipated some great awakening. Understanding struck her like a physical blow. The frozen hut had not been merely a shelter. It had been a keystone, a focal point for magic that predated even the oldest settlements. By awakening it, she had begun to rouse forces that had slept since the time of legends, forces that could reshape not just the balance of power among the Jarls, but the very nature of the world. She thought of Bjorn's warning about magic's price, felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a lead cloak. The power at her disposal could save the fjord from Grimwald's ambitions, but wielding it would mark her as something beyond mortal concerns. She would become a figure of legend herself, feared, worshipped perhaps, but forever apart from the people she sought to protect. Snow continued to fall outside, each flake catching and holding the magical light that now suffused her domain. In the distance, wolves howled their ancient songs, and Astrid wondered if they too sensed the change that was coming. 2 days. She had 2 days to decide whether to remain in exile and let events unfold as they would, or to embrace the power that thrummed in her very bones and step back into a world that would never again see her as merely human. The pool's surface stilled, reflecting only her own face, but for a moment she could have sworn she saw her father's eyes looking back at her, patient and knowing, as if he had always expected this choice would come. She had spent the previous evening studying the runes carved into the wooden beams, their meanings slowly becoming clearer as the magic awakened dormant knowledge within her mind. They spoke of binding, of balance, of a power that could reshape the very foundations of the world if wielded with sufficient will and understanding. But power meant nothing without purpose, and Astrid's purpose remained unchanged, to reclaim her honor and forge a new path in a world that had cast her aside. The sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed across the frozen landscape, drawing her attention to the tree line below. A lone rider emerged from the shadows between the pines, his horse struggling through the deep snow. Even at this distance, Astrid recognized the distinctive blue cloak and silver arm rings that marked him as one of Jarl Eric's messengers. She retreated into the hut and retrieved her weapons, strapping her sword to her hip and securing the ancient spear she had found buried beneath the floorboards. The weapon felt alive in her hands, its carved shaft warm despite the bitter cold, and she could sense the power thrumming through its iron point. By the time the messenger reached the clearing before her hut, Astrid stood waiting, every muscle coiled and ready for whatever news he brought. The young man dismounted and approached with careful steps, his eyes wide as he took in the sight of the transformed dwelling. Where once there had been a simple wooden structure, now stood something altogether more impressive. The walls gleamed with an inner light that made the snow around them sparkle like scattered diamonds, and strange symbols flickered across the surface of the door like living flames. "Astrid Ironsdottir," the messenger called, his voice cracking slightly. "I bring word from Jarl Eric of the eastern settlements." "Speak," she commanded, her grip tightening on the spear shaft. "The Jarl requests your presence at the Great Hall. The ice wraiths that have plagued our lands these past weeks have grown bolder. 3 more farmsteads were attacked in the night, and the warriors sent to drive them back have not returned. The people whisper that only one who has faced the ancient spirits and survived might know how to defeat them." Astrid felt a cold smile touch her lips. So Eric had finally swallowed his pride enough to seek her aid. The same man who had banished her for failing to protect his son now came crawling back when faced with threats his warriors could not handle. "And what does the Jarl offer in return for my assistance?" she asked. The messenger shifted uncomfortably, his breath steaming in the frigid air. "Full restoration of your honor and status, a place at his war council, your choice of lands and a ship to command." "Pretty words," Astrid mused, stepping closer. The young man's horse whinnied nervously as she approached, its eyes rolling white with fear. "But I have learned not to trust the promises of Jarls. Tell me, boy, what do you see when you look upon this place?" The messenger glanced around nervously, taking in the otherworldly glow of the hut, the way the snow seemed to bend away from the structure as if repelled by an invisible force. "I see magic, lady, power such as the old stories speak of." "Indeed. And what need have I of Eric's lands when I have claimed something far more valuable? What use are his ships when I command forces that sailed these fjords when his ancestors were still learning to walk upright?" The spear in her hands pulsed with approval, and for a moment the messenger saw something flicker behind Astrid's eyes, something ancient and terrible and utterly without mercy. "Return to your master," she continued, her voice carrying an edge that cut through the wind. "Tell him that Astrid Ironsdottir will come to his hall, but not as a supplicant seeking forgiveness. I come as an equal, with power at my back and terms of my own to offer. He may keep his promises of restoration. I no longer need them." The messenger nodded hastily and stumbled back toward his horse. As he mounted and prepared to ride away, Astrid called after him, "And tell the Jarl that when I arrive, he would do well to remember which of us now holds the keys to victory. The old ways are returning, whether he wills it or not." She watched the rider disappear into the forest, then turned back toward her hut. The ancient magic stirred within the walls, responding to her resolve, and she felt the first stirrings of a plan that would reshape not just her own destiny, but the fate of all who dwelt along these frozen shores. The ancient runestone pulsed with an otherworldly light as Astrid pressed her palm against its surface. The moment her skin made contact, visions flooded her mind, images of a time when the gods still walked among mortals. when the barriers between realms were thin as spider silk. She saw the hut's original inhabitant, a Volva named Helga Frostwhisper, who had bound her very essence into the dwelling before the great winter that nearly ended all life in the fjord. "The magic isn't just in the stones," Astrid whispered, understanding flooding through her. "It's in the blood sacrifice she made." Her life force became the foundation. Behind her, Bjorn shifted uneasily. "What does that mean for you, for us?" Before she could answer, the sound of marching feet echoed across the frozen landscape. Through the crystalline windows, Astrid could see torches flickering in the distance, dozens of them, moving in formation. Jarl Magnus had finally found her sanctuary. "They're using tracking hounds," Bjorn observed grimly, pointing to the dark shapes bounding ahead of the warriors, "and something else." His voice carried a note of dread. "Look at the way they move, too fluid, too fast." Astrid's blood chilled as she recognized the unnatural gait of the creatures leading Magnus's forces. Draugr, the walking dead, summoned from their barrows by dark magic. The Jarl had made a pact with forces beyond the mortal realm to reclaim what he believed was rightfully his. "How long do we have?" she asked, her hand still pressed against the runestone, drawing power from its ancient reservoir. "Minutes, maybe less." Bjorn was already checking his weapons, but they both knew steel would do little against the undead. The hut trembled around them, responding to Astrid's rising fear and determination. Ice began forming intricate patterns across the walls, and the air itself seemed to thicken with magical energy. She could feel Helga's consciousness stirring within the structure, ancient wisdom pressing against the edges of her mind. "You must choose," came the Volva's voice, not heard but felt in her bones. "Accept the full burden, or watch everything burn." "What burden?" Astrid demanded aloud. "To become the guardian, to bind yourself to this place as I did. Your life force will sustain the magic for generations, but you will never be truly free." The torches were closer now, and Astrid could hear Magnus's voice booming across the ice. "Surrender, Shieldmaiden. You've caused enough disruption. Return what you've stolen, and your death will be swift." Stolen, as if power could truly belong to any one person, as if the magic itself hadn't chosen her when she'd stumbled half-frozen into its embrace. "There has to be another way," Bjorn said desperately, having heard enough of the exchange to understand the choice before them. Astrid closed her eyes, reaching deeper into the runestone's memory. There, a fragment of possibility, dangerous but not impossible. The magic could be unbound from its physical anchor, dispersed across the fjord itself. It would weaken the concentrated power, but spread protection to all who dwelt in these lands. The cost would be different, but no less severe. She would become a conduit, forever changed, forever wandering between the mortal realm and the realm of spirits. "I found another path," she breathed. Then louder, "But I need time." The first of the Draugr had reached the hut's perimeter. Ancient corpses wrapped in rusted mail, their empty eye sockets blazing with cold fire, they began circling the structure like wolves. Where their feet touched the enchanted ground, the grass withered and frost spread in diseased patterns. Bjorn hefted his axe. "I'll buy you what time I can." "No." Astrid's voice carried new authority, power drawn from the depths of the Volva's knowledge. "This is my fight." She stepped outside, and the hut responded to her will, growing and shifting behind her. Ice formed armor across her body, not the crude plate she'd worn as a shield maiden, but something elegant and terrible, carved with runes that seemed to move and breathe. In her hands, frost coalesced into a spear that hummed with barely contained energy. Magnus stepped forward from among his living warriors, keeping well back from his undead vanguard. "Impressive theater, Astrid, but you're still outnumbered, still alone." "Am I?" She drove the butt of her spear into the ground, and the ice beneath her feet sang with power. "Helga Frostwhisper stands with me. The spirits of every warrior who died defending this fjord stand with me. Every person you've wronged, every family you've torn apart, they stand with me." The Draugr hesitated, their supernatural senses detecting the gathering of otherworldly forces. Even Magnus took a step backward as the temperature plummeted and the aurora borealis began dancing overhead, though dawn was still hours away. Astrid raised her spear and made her choice. The ice beneath Astrid's feet groaned ominously as she pressed her palm against the crystalline barrier separating her from Bjorn and his warriors. Through the translucent wall, she could see their faces contorted with rage and fear, their weapons useless against the magical fortress that had erupted from the ancient hut. "You cannot hide behind your sorcery forever, witch." Bjorn's muffled voice carried through the ice, his breath fogging against its surface. "The Jarl will hear of this betrayal." Astrid pulled her hand away, watching frost patterns spiral outward from where she had touched the wall. The power thrumming through her veins felt both intoxicating and terrifying. Each heartbeat sent waves of ancient magic coursing through her body, connecting her to something far greater than herself. Behind her, the transformed interior of the hut pulsed with ethereal blue light. What had once been simple wooden walls now gleamed with ice that seemed alive, shifting and breathing with her emotions. Runes she couldn't read carved themselves into the frozen surfaces, their meaning somehow clear in her mind, despite their foreign script. The old woman's voice echoed from everywhere and nowhere, a whisper that seemed to emerge from the very walls themselves. "The blood of the ice speakers runs true in your veins, child. Your ancestors built this sanctuary when the world was young, and magic flowed freely through the 9 realms." "Ice speakers?" Astrid turned slowly, searching for the source of the voice. "I don't understand. I'm nothing but a disgraced warrior cast out by my own people. You are the last of an ancient bloodline, one that your enemies have long sought to extinguish." The temperature in the room dropped further, and Astrid's breath came out in silver clouds. "They feared what you might become, what power you might unlock. Your disgrace was no accident." The implications hit her like a physical blow. Every betrayal, every whispered accusation of cowardice, every moment of shame and exile, all orchestrated to keep her from discovering this truth. The battle where her shield sisters had fallen wasn't lost through her failure. It was a trap designed to break her spirit and drive her into the wilderness. Outside, she could hear Bjorn shouting orders to his men. The scrape of metal against ice suggested they were attempting to hack through the barrier, though their efforts seemed laughably futile against the magical defenses. "What am I supposed to do with this knowledge?" Astrid asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Even if what you say is true, I'm still just one person against an entire fjord." "Are you?" The old woman materialized before her, though she appeared more translucent than before, as if the act of revealing the truth was draining her remaining essence. "Look closer, child. See what your awakening has begun." Astrid approached one of the ice walls and peered through it. In the distance, beyond Bjorn's war party, she could see lights moving across the frozen landscape. Torches and lanterns bobbed through the darkness like fallen stars, converging on their location from multiple directions. But these weren't more enemies. As the figures drew closer, she recognized the distinctive silhouettes of thralls and outcasts, the dispossessed and forgotten members of various settlements. They moved with purpose, their faces turned toward the brilliant spire of light that now stretched from the hut toward the aurora-painted sky. "They feel it," the old woman explained, her form beginning to fade. "The awakening calls to all who have been cast aside, all who remember the old ways in their bones. You are not alone, Astrid Ironwill. You never were." The name struck her like lightning. Ironwill, not the patronymic she had carried all her life, but something older, more fundamental. It resonated in her chest like a war cry, filling the hollow spaces that exile and shame had carved from her soul. Bjorn's voice grew more desperate outside. "Whatever game you're playing ends now. Come out and face justice." Astrid laughed, surprising herself with the sound. Justice? These men who had orchestrated her downfall, who had allowed her shield sisters to die to preserve their secret, spoke of justice. She pressed both hands against the ice wall and felt it respond to her will. The barrier began to shift, not dissolving but transforming. creating an opening just wide enough for her to step through. The frigid air bit at her exposed skin, but she no longer felt the cold as an enemy. "Stand down, Bjorn," she commanded, her voice carrying across the frozen waste with supernatural clarity. "You have no authority here." The warriors stepped back involuntarily, their weapons trembling in their grips. Behind them, the approaching lights had resolved into dozens of figures, all moving with the same inexorable purpose. The dispossessed had heard the call, and they were coming home. Bjorn's face twisted with desperate fury. "Kill her! Kill the witch before she corrupts them all!" But as his men raised their weapons, Astrid smiled. The old magic sang in her blood, and winter itself bent to her will. The ice beneath Astrid's feet groaned ominously as she pressed deeper into the glacier's heart, following the pulsing blue veins of ancient magic that seemed to call to her very bones. The frozen corridors had grown narrower, forcing her to squeeze through passages carved by powers beyond mortal understanding. Behind her, she could hear the distant shouts of Bjorn's warriors, their torches casting wild shadows that danced like demons on the crystalline walls. Her breath came in sharp puffs as she rounded another corner, and suddenly the passage opened into a vast chamber that stole what little air remained in her lungs. The cavern stretched upward into darkness, its walls lined with what appeared to be frozen waterfalls, but as her eyes adjusted, she realized they were cascades of pure magical energy, suspended in time and ice for countless centuries. At the center of the chamber stood something that made her heart hammer against her ribs. A throne carved from a single massive block of ice rose from the floor, its surface etched with runes that hurt to look at directly. The symbols seemed to shift and writhe when she wasn't focusing on them, whispering secrets in a language that predated human speech. But it wasn't the throne that held her transfixed, it was the figure seated upon it. The woman appeared to be sleeping, her skin pale as winter moonlight, her long silver hair flowing over the armrests like spilled starlight. She wore armor that seemed forged from the northern lights themselves, plates of ethereal metal that shimmered with impossible colors. Most striking of all was the sword resting across her lap, its blade radiating cold so intense that frost formed in the air around it. Astrid took a trembling step forward, then another. Something about the woman's face seemed familiar, as if she were looking into a mirror that reflected not her current self, but some distant ancestor. The magic in the chamber responded to her presence, the frozen waterfalls beginning to glow more brightly, casting everything in an otherworldly blue radiance. "You have come at last, daughter of winter's blood." The voice didn't come from the woman on the throne. Her lips remained still, her breathing deep and even in eternal slumber. Instead, the words seemed to emanate from the ice itself, from the very air around Astrid. "I don't understand," Astrid whispered, her words creating small clouds in the frigid air. "Who are you? What is this place?" "I am Valdris the Stormborn, first of the Ice Queens, keeper of winter's deepest secrets. And you, Shield Daughter, are my heir, the last of a bloodline I thought lost to time and war." The revelation hit Astrid like a physical blow. She staggered backward, her mind reeling as fragments of half-remembered stories began to fall into place. The legends spoke of an ancient queen who had ruled these lands before the coming of the Jarls, a sorceress who had commanded the very elements themselves. "That's impossible," she breathed. "The Ice Queens are myths, stories told to frighten children." "Are they?" The voice carried a note of ancient amusement. "Tell me, child, did the hut feel like a myth when it responded to your touch? Did the magic flowing through your veins feel like mere stories when you called down lightning upon your enemies?" Astrid couldn't deny the truth in those words. The power she had awakened in the frozen hut had felt as natural as breathing, as if she were remembering something long forgotten rather than learning something new. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed from the passage behind her, growing louder by the moment. Bjorn's men were closing in, and she could hear the Jarl's voice among them, harsh and commanding. "They come for you," Valdris observed. "The Pretender King fears what you represent, the return of the old ways, the restoration of true power to these lands. But first, you must choose." Choose what? Whether to claim your birthright or flee into exile. The sword upon my lap is Rhymebane, forged in the heart of the first winter, tempered in the breath of ancient dragons. Take it, and you take upon yourself the mantle of Ice Queen. All the power of your bloodline will flow through you, but so too will all its responsibilities and burdens. Astrid stared at the weapon, her hands trembling with more than cold. She could feel its power calling to her, promising strength beyond imagination, the ability to reshape the fjord according to her will. But she could also sense something else, a terrible weight of duty, the burden of rulership that would transform her into something more and less than human. The footsteps were almost upon her now. In moments, Bjorn and his warriors would burst into the chamber, and her choice would be made for her, likely at the point of a sword. She stepped forward, her hand reaching toward Rhymbane's ice-wreathed hilt. The moment her fingers brushed the weapon's surface, the world exploded into brilliant white light, and she felt her destiny crystallize around her like forming ice. The ice beneath Astrid's feet groaned ominously as she pressed her palm against the crystalline barrier separating her from Jarl Ericsson's war fleet. Through the translucent wall, she could see the distorted figures of warriors scrambling across their ships, their shouts muffled but frantic. The magic coursed through her veins like liquid starlight, demanding release, begging her to let it loose upon those who had cast her out. "You could end this now," whispered the voice that had been growing stronger since she'd first touched the ancient runes. One gesture, and the fjord would be yours. They would kneel before the power they were too blind to see. Astrid's fingers curled into a fist, frost spiraling outward from her touch. The temptation was overwhelming. These same men had watched as Ericsson stripped her of her honor, had turned their backs when she was banished for refusing his bed. Now they cowered behind ice walls of her making, and she held their lives in her hands. But Bjorn's voice cut through the magical whispers, like a blade through fog. "Astrid, the village!" She spun around, her enhanced vision piercing the storm to see what he had spotted. Dark shapes moved through the blizzard, not Ericsson's men, but something else entirely. The Draugr had awakened, drawn by the surge of ancient magic she'd unleashed. Their skeletal forms shambled through the snow toward the fishing village on the far shore, where families huddled in their homes, unaware of the approaching horror. The realization hit her like a physical blow. In her fury, in her desire for revenge, she had forgotten the innocent lives scattered around the fjord. The magic wanted her to focus on power, on domination, but those fishermen's children didn't deserve to pay for her vendetta. "The barrier won't hold the Draugr," Bjorn called out, already moving toward his weapons, "and neither will the villagers' doors." Astrid looked back at the trapped fleet, then toward the advancing undead. Two threats, two choices. She could maintain the ice prison and watch the Draugr slaughter the helpless, or she could release Ericsson's warriors to help defend the innocent and risk them turning on her the moment the immediate danger passed. The ancient voice in her head hissed its displeasure. "Let them all fall. Build your empire on their bones. That is the way of true power." "No." The word escaped her lips as barely more than a breath, but it carried the weight of absolute decision. She had been cast out for refusing to compromise her honor once before. She would not abandon it now, no matter what the magic promised. With a gesture that felt like tearing away part of her soul, Astrid shattered the ice barrier. The crystalline wall exploded outward in a shower of glittering fragments, freeing Ericsson's ships. Immediately, war horns began to sound across the water as the Jarl's men spotted the shambling forms approaching the village. "You fool!" the voice raged inside her mind. "You had them! You had everything!" But Astrid was already moving, drawing upon the magic in a different way. Instead of wielding it as a weapon of conquest, she shaped it as a tool of protection. Ice flowed from her hands, not to imprison but to create. Bridges spanning the choppy waters, defensive walls around the village, barriers to funnel the Draugr into killing grounds where armed warriors would have the advantage. Bjorn fought beside her as they raced across her ice bridge toward the village, his axe gleaming with reflected magical light. Behind them, She could hear the splash of oars as Ericsson's longships rushed to join the defense. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was using stolen magic to save the very people who had exiled her. The first Draugr reached the village outskirts just as Astrid arrived. The creature's empty sockets fixed on her, and its jaw unhinged in a soundless scream. She met its charge with a spear of ice that punched through its ribcage, but 3 more emerged from the storm behind it. Warriors from the fleet began pouring onto the shore, their earlier fear of her magic forgotten in the face of a more immediate threat. She caught sight of Eriksson himself, his golden beard stark against his battle-scarred face, directing his men with practiced efficiency. Their eyes met across the chaos for a single moment, and she saw something there she hadn't expected. Not gratitude exactly, but a grudging acknowledgement. The battle raged through the night, ice and steel working in deadly harmony. Astrid found herself fighting not just the Draugr, but the constant whispers of the ancient magic urging her to turn her power against her former kinsman. Each time she resisted, each time she chose protection over revenge, the voice grew more distant, its hold on her weakening. As dawn broke over the fjord, the last of the undead fell to her ice-wreathed spear. The village was saved, Eriksson's fleet was intact, and Astrid stood amid the aftermath, forever changed but still herself. The ice sang beneath Sigrid's feet as she raced across the frozen fjord, the ancient magic coursing through her veins like liquid fire. Behind her, the transformed hut blazed with ethereal light, its crystalline walls pulsing in rhythm with her heartbeat. She could feel Jarl Magnus's forces closing in from 3 directions, their torches cutting through the winter darkness like angry stars. The runes carved into her arms glowed brighter with each step, and she realized the magic wasn't just flowing through her, it was changing her. Her breath no longer formed clouds in the bitter cold, and her vision pierced the night as clearly as if it were midday. The ancient power had awakened something primal within her bloodline, something that had slumbered for generations. A horn blast echoed across the ice, followed by another from the eastern shore. Magnus had divided his army just as she'd hoped, but the satisfaction was short-lived as she spotted the dark shapes emerging from the tree line ahead. More soldiers positioned to cut off her escape route to the sacred grove, where the old magic still ran strong. Sigrid slowed her pace, her hand instinctively moving to the hilt of her sword. The weapon had changed too, its blade now shimmering with the same ethereal energy that surrounded the hut. She could sense the fear radiating from the approaching warriors, their uncertainty about the transformed woman before them. "Stand down, Sigrid the Exile," called a familiar voice. Eric Bloodhand stepped forward from among the soldiers, his massive frame silhouetted against the starlight. "The Jarl offers mercy if you surrender the ancient power willingly." A bitter laugh escaped her lips. "Mercy? From the man who cast me out for speaking truth? Tell me, Eric, does Magnus still wake screaming from dreams of burning ships?" Eric's grip tightened on his warhammer. "The Jarl's nightmares are not your concern. That magic belongs to our people, not to a disgraced Shieldmaiden who—" "Who what?" Sigrid interrupted, taking a step forward. The ice beneath her feet began to glow, spreading outward in intricate patterns that resembled the runes covering her arms. "Who discovered what our ancestors truly were? Who unlocked the power that could save us all from the coming darkness?" The soldiers behind Eric shifted nervously as the glowing patterns spread further across the ice. Some of the younger warriors had begun to back away, their courage failing in the face of such otherworldly display. "The power is too great for one person," Eric said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier conviction. "It will consume you, just as it consumed the last keeper centuries ago." Sigrid felt a flicker of doubt at his words, but then the magic pulsed stronger within her, bringing with it visions of the past. She saw the ancient keeper Eric spoke of, not consumed by the power, but sacrificing herself to hide it from those who would misuse it. The magic had been waiting, dormant, for someone worthy to claim it. "You understand nothing," she said, her voice carrying across the ice with unnatural resonance. The keeper wasn't consumed. She chose to become one with the magic to protect it. And now I understand why. The sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed from multiple directions as the rest of Magnus's forces converged on their position. Sigrid could see torches reflecting off armor and weapons, hundreds of them surrounding the frozen expanse where she stood. Eric raised his hammer, its iron head gleaming in the magical light. "I'm sorry, Sigrid, but this ends now." She drew her transformed sword, and the blade sang as it cut through the air. "Yes, Eric, it does." The first charge came from 3 directions simultaneously. Sigrid moved like winter wind itself, the magic guiding her steps across the treacherous ice. Her sword parted steel as easily as cloth, leaving trails of azure fire in its wake. Warriors fell back, some in pain, others in awe of the power she wielded. But even as she fought, Sigrid could feel the strain building. The magic was vast, older than memory, and channeling it through her mortal form was taking its toll. Each spell, each supernatural movement, pulled something vital from deep within her. Eric's hammer crashed down where she had stood a heartbeat before, shattering the ice and sending freezing water spraying across the battlefield. She spun away from the blow, her blade finding the gap between his shoulder plates, but the wound only seemed to enrage him further. "The magic is killing you," he growled, swinging again. "Can't you feel it burning through your soul?" She could. With each passing moment, the line between Sigrid and the ancient power blurred further. Soon, she would face the same choice as the keeper before her: surrender the magic and watch it fall into the wrong hands, or become something more than human to protect it. As Magnus himself appeared at the edge of the battle, his golden armor gleaming and his eyes fixed on her with predatory hunger, Sigrid realized the moment of choosing had arrived. The ice beneath Astrid's feet groaned ominously as she faced the assembled Jarls, their warriors spread across the frozen fjord like pieces on a game board. The ancient magic coursed through her veins, making her hyper-aware of every shifting current in the air, every creak of leather armor, every whispered prayer to the gods. Jarl Magnus stepped forward, his breath forming clouds in the bitter air. "You've made your choice then, witch. You stand with the old ways against progress." "I stand with balance," Astrid replied, her voice carrying farther than it should have across the ice. The hut behind her pulsed with ethereal light, its wooden walls now seeming to breathe with life. "Something you've forgotten in your hunger for conquest." Eric moved to her left flank, his axe gleaming despite the overcast sky. She felt rather than saw Bjorn take position on her right, the young warrior's nervousness radiating through the magical connection she'd begun to share with those who'd chosen to follow her. "Balance?" Magnus laughed, the sound harsh and grating. "You speak of balance while wielding cider that could tear apart the very foundations of our world." The Volva's warnings were clear. Such power corrupts absolutely. Astrid's fingers traced the runic symbols that had appeared along her forearms, their meaning becoming clearer with each passing moment. The ancient magic hadn't been lost by accident. It had been deliberately hidden, waiting for someone desperate enough, worthy enough, to accept both its gifts and its terrible responsibilities. The Volva spoke truth, she acknowledged, but not complete truth. This magic doesn't corrupt. It reveals. It shows us what we truly are beneath our pretenses and fears. The wind picked up, swirling snow between the two forces. Astrid felt the ice responding to her presence, recognizing something primal in the magic that flowed through her. The fjord itself was choosing sides. Jarl Harald raised his sword, its blade catching what little light penetrated the clouds. "Enough words. We came here to end this threat, not debate philosophy with a mad woman." The first arrow came without warning, loosed by one of Magnus's archers. Astrid watched it arc through the air, time seeming to slow as the magic heightened her perceptions. She raised her hand instinctively, and ice crystals materialized from nowhere, forming a barrier that sent the arrow spinning harmlessly away. The battle erupted in chaos. Eric's war cry split the air as he charged toward the nearest cluster of enemy warriors. His axe sang through the frozen air, meeting shield and sword with bone-jarring impacts. Bjorn followed close behind, his youthful enthusiasm tempered by the training Astrid had drilled into him during their journey. But it was the magic that truly turned the tide of combat into something extraordinary. Astrid found herself moving with inhuman grace, the ancient power guiding her steps across ice that would have been treacherous for any normal warrior. Where she gestured, frost bloomed across enemy weapons, making metal brittle enough to shatter. Where she stepped, the ice beneath her opponent's feet became slick as glass. Magnus himself came for her, his massive sword cutting through the space where she'd been standing moments before. "Face me without your tricks, coward." "This is no trick," Astrid replied, deflecting his next strike with a barrier of hardened air. "This is what you fear most, change you cannot control." Their duel became a deadly dance across the ice. Magnus fought with the brutal efficiency of decades of experience, his blade seeking any opening in her supernatural defenses. But Astrid was no longer entirely human, and her responses came from instincts older than the fjord itself. Around them, the battle raged with desperate intensity. She glimpsed Eric grappling with two warriors at once, his strength barely sufficient to keep their weapons from finding his throat. Bjorn had been separated from his allies, surrounded by enemies who showed no mercy for his youth. The magic demanded a choice. She could feel its full power beckoning, promising victory if she would only embrace it completely. All she had to do was let go of her humanity, accept transformation into something beyond mortal concerns. Instead, she reached deeper into the ancient wisdom flowing through her consciousness, seeking not domination but understanding. The magic had never been meant for conquest. It was meant for protection, for maintaining the delicate balance between civilization and the wild forces that surrounded it. With this realization came clarity. Astrid raised both hands, and the very air around the battlefield shimmered. The ice beneath everyone's feet began to crack, not to harm, but to separate. Fissures opened between the opposing forces, creating barriers that made continued combat impossible. "Enough!" Her voice boomed across the fjord with supernatural authority. "Look around you. See what your ambition has brought." The fighters on both sides found themselves isolated on small ice floes, the frigid water of the fjord lapping between them. The immediate threat of violence had passed, but Astrid knew this was merely a reprieve. The real confrontation, the one that would determine the fate of everyone on these waters, was only beginning. The ancient runes carved into the hut's walls blazed with ethereal light as Astrid pressed her palm against the central symbol. Power coursed through her veins like liquid fire, and she gasped as visions flooded her mind. Memories of the Volva who had built this sanctuary centuries ago, who had bound her very essence into these weathered planks and stones. "She's drawing too much at once," Bjorn warned, his voice seeming to come from across a vast distance. "The magic will consume her." But Astrid couldn't stop now. Below them, Jarl Grimwald's warband had reached the base of the cliff, their torches creating a constellation of threats in the darkness. Behind them marched twice as many warriors as she'd expected. The other Jarls had answered his call for war, bringing with them the promise of conquest and the scent of bloodshed. The hut shuddered around them as ancient timbers began to glow from within. Through the narrow window, Astrid watched in awe as the very landscape responded to her touch. Trees twisted themselves into new configurations, their branches weaving together to form barriers across the main path. The fjord's waters began to churn, responding to currents that had nothing to do with wind or tide. "Astrid," Solveig's voice cut through the magical tumult, "you're changing everything. This won't just stop Grimwald. This will reshape the entire region." She knew her friend was right. The power flowing through her was vast beyond anything she'd imagined, ancient beyond mortal comprehension. The Volva's memories showed her how this magic had once been used to raise mountains and carve fjords, to call down the very wrath of the gods themselves. It was meant to be wielded carefully, sparingly, not unleashed in desperate fury. But Grimwald's war cry echoed up from below, filled with murderous intent. "Burn everything! The witch-touched cannot be allowed to live." The decision crystallized in her mind with sudden clarity. She had spent too many years accepting defeat, allowing others to define her worth, letting shame and exile drive her into hiding. The magic thrumming through the hut wasn't just power, it was responsibility. The Volva had preserved it for someone who would use it not for conquest, but for protection. Astrid stepped back from the wall, her hand still tingling with residual energy. The runes continued to glow, but more softly now, responding to her shifted intention. Instead of unleashing raw destruction, she began to weave something more subtle, more lasting. "What are you doing?" Eric asked, moving to her side. In his eyes she saw not fear but trust, absolute faith in her judgment. "Creating a choice," she replied, her voice carrying newfound authority, "for Grimwald, for all of them." The magic spiraled outward from the hut in careful patterns, touching the minds of the approaching warriors. Not compelling them, the Volva's memories had shown her the danger in that, but offering them clarity, stripping away the battle madness and bloodlust, revealing the true cost of the path they walked. Through the enhanced connection, Astrid felt their confusion ripple across the mountainside. Warriors, who had been eager for conquest, suddenly remembered why they'd truly come, not for glory, but because Grimwald had convinced them she represented a threat to their families, their way of life. Now they could sense the truth, that her power was defensive, protective, focused on healing rather than harm. But Grimwald himself remained untouched by the revelation. His mind was too closed, too consumed with ambition and hatred to accept any truth that contradicted his chosen narrative. He screamed orders at his wavering followers, drawing his blade and threatening those who hesitated. "She weakens your will with her sorcery. Fight through it. Remember what she's stolen from us." Some obeyed, their loyalty to their Jarl overriding the clarity the magic had provided. But many others simply stopped, lowering their weapons as they truly understood what they had been asked to do. The hut around them continued to transform, its humble exterior now revealing chambers and passages that couldn't possibly fit within its original dimensions. Astrid realized the Volva had built not just a shelter, but a sanctuary that existed partially outside normal space. A place where the old knowledge could be preserved and taught to those worthy of receiving it. "This isn't ending tonight," she said, watching Grimwald rally his remaining followers. "This is just the beginning." Solvig nodded grimly. "He'll return with hired mercenaries next time, men whose loyalty is bought rather than earned. They won't be swayed by truth or clarity. Then we'll be ready," Eric said simply. "All of us." Through the magic still flowing between them, Astrid felt the presence of the scattered peoples across the fjord, farmers and fishermen, craftsmen and scholars, all those who valued building over destroying. The power within the hut could reach them too, could offer them the same clarity and protection it had shown the warriors tonight. The age of Jarls ruling through strength alone was ending. What would replace it remained to be seen, but as Grimwald's forces finally retreated into the darkness, Astrid knew that whatever came next, it would be shaped by wisdom rather than mere ambition. The true battle for the fjord's future was only beginning. The dawn sky blazed crimson over the fjord, as Astrid stood at the threshold of what had once been an ancient frozen hut. Behind her, the structure hummed with otherworldly energy, its walls now gleaming with crystalline formations that pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat. The magic she had awakened flowed through her veins like molten silver, and she could feel every living thing within a league's distance. The nervous breathing of the warriors gathered below, the ancient spirits stirring in the depths of the fjord, and something else, something vast and hungry approaching from the northern waters. Jarl Ericsson's war band had arrived at first light, their shields locked and spears bristling like a forest of iron. But behind them came another force that made Astrid's blood run cold. Ships bearing the raven banners of King Magnus himself, their black hulls cutting through the morning mist like the teeth of some primordial beast. "You cannot hold this power alone," called a voice from behind her. Astrid turned to see Olaf the Wise emerging from the transformed hut, his weathered face etched with concern. The old skald had sought her out 3 days ago, drawn by dreams of awakening magic and ancient prophecies. The spirits whisper of a choice that must be made. Astrid's hand tightened around the haft of her war axe, its blade now gleaming with the same ethereal light that suffused the hut. "I've made my choice, old man. I will not bow to those who cast me out." But even as she spoke, doubt gnawed at her. The power coursing through her was intoxicating, but she could feel its hunger, its desire to reshape everything in its path. The very stones beneath her feet had begun to change, sprouting crystalline growths that sang with harmonic frequencies she felt in her bones. A horn sounded from the fjord, deep and resonant. King Magnus himself stood in the prow of the lead ship, his golden beard whipping in the wind, his voice carrying across the water with supernatural clarity. "Astrid Ironsdottir, I offer you one chance to surrender this cursed magic and accept exile beyond the northern wastes. Refuse, and I will see this place burned to bedrock." The magic flared within her at the insult, and Astrid felt the ancient spirits respond to her anger. The fjord waters began to churn, and spectral forms rose from the depths, the drowned warriors of a dozen forgotten battles, their ghostly weapons gleaming with the same light that emanated from the hut. "You see," Olaf whispered urgently, "the power seeks only destruction, but there is another way." Astrid whirled on him, her eyes blazing with otherworldly fire. "What way? They hunt me like a rabid wolf. They would see me destroyed for daring to claim what was hidden here." "Not claim," the skald said, his voice gentle but firm. "Guide. The ancient ones who built this place were not conquerors, they were guardians. The magic was never meant to serve one person's will, but to protect the balance itself." Below them, the first clash had begun. Jarl Ericsson's warriors surged up the narrow path toward the hut, but the crystalline formations responded to Astrid's presence, creating barriers of living stone that turned their advance into a deadly maze. She could feel their fear, their awe, their desperate courage as they pressed forward despite the supernatural obstacles. King Magnus leaped from his ship into the shallow water, his own blade wreathed in flames, a weapon blessed by the southern priests, designed to combat exactly this sort of forbidden magic. His elite huskarls followed, their faces grim with determination. "Choose quickly," Olaf urged. "Use the power to destroy them all, and you become the very darkness this place was built to contain." Or what?" Astrid snarled, watching Magnus stride through the churning waters toward shore, his flame sword cutting through the spectral defenders like they were morning mist. "Or you fulfill the true purpose of this gift. Become the guardian, not the conqueror. Show them that some powers are too great for any one person to wield, even you." The words hit her like a physical blow. Astrid looked down at her hands, seeing how the crystalline growths had begun to spread up her arms, marking her transformation into something no longer entirely human. She thought of Jorik, her fallen shield brother, and the oath she had sworn to prove her worth. But what was worth, really, if it came at the cost of everything she had once protected? Magnus reached the shore, his war cry echoing off the stone walls of the fjord. Above them, storm clouds gathered with unnatural speed, pregnant with the magic that now saturated the very air. Astrid closed her eyes and felt for the heart of the ancient power, not to command it, but to understand it. And in that moment of connection, she finally saw the true choice before her, not between victory and defeat, but between becoming a legend and remaining human. The fate of the fjord hung in the balance as she made her decision.